Jim Baskell back with you on the College Football Rankings Reaction Show here on CBS Sports HQ. Let's get right to it, right to the top 10 from 10 through 7. You see, Penn State, despite the loss, stays right there in the front 10. Oklahoma and Minnesota are 7 and 8 with Baylor right back of them. Here is your look at the big change, and it's right at the top. The Ohio State Buckeyes are the new number 1, jumping LSU. Buckeyes get that win over Penn State. That propels them to 1. LSU staying unbeaten. They're at 2. Clemson, the only other unbeaten team, at 3. And Georgia stays there, stiff-arming Alabama for that 4th spot. In Utah, you'd see they jumped Oregon. The Utes get the win, and Oregon losing to Arizona State. So there's your front 6, and the big change there, obviously, 1 and 2 with the Buckeyes in at number 1. Let's bring back Jerry Palm along with Barrett Sallee to get some reaction here. I'll start with you, Jerry. Any surprise there at the top of the rankings?
No, it's not a surprise. I didn't pick it, but I knew it was possible because Ohio State's strength of schedule has now caught up to and past LSU. They have definitely been the more dominant team this season. There was a case for Ohio State to pass LSU really beginning with last week. And it was just a matter of time if Ohio State kept winning that could happen. However, don't think of this as permanent. If Ohio State beats Michigan next week, yes, they'll stay number 1. But LSU has got a better opponent and could have a much better opponent in that SEC championship game, especially if Ohio State ends up with Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game. So this isn't necessarily a permanent move, but it is really the correct move for now. And as far as I'm concerned, they could have even done it last week.
Yeah, Jerry, I mean, I had Ohio State number 1 in my CBS 130 ballot. Like, they're the most complete team in college football. I think anybody who's watched them knows just how good they are. And I think you're right. It's more about the fluidity of a schedule, right? Because Ohio State's schedule obviously has picked up steam. And at the same time, we all talk about LSU's schedule being all that great. But, I mean, let's be honest. We had a situation with Texas early in the season where LSU treated that as a big win. Well, Texas is now 6-5, so LSU's quote-unquote great resume still there, but maybe not as great as we once thought it was. So, yeah, I mean, I wasn't necessarily surprised to see Ohio State there. I thought that after what they did to Penn State, they like game control, and aside from like a 5-minute hiccup when they decided to fumble a couple times, they seemed like they were in control of that game. So I think they got it right. I think Ohio State's the best team in the country, and the resume, like Jerry said, is certainly getting beefed up over the last couple of weeks.
All right, Barrett, let me paint a picture, if I can, for you. That's 1-2. Let's focus on the 5-6 teams, if you will, and I'm really targeting Alabama and the Utes here. Should Alabama win the Iron Bowl, let's just say impressively, and the Utes go through and beat Oregon in the Pac-12 title game, and Georgia does ultimately lose to LSU in the SEC title game, who gets that 4th spot in your eyes?
I think it'll go to Utah. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that should happen, but I think that's what the committee will say because they do value conference championships. And when you look at Utah, you know, I know folks will say, well, the eye test always favors Alabama. Well, yeah, if you're talking about talent, of course it does. They're the most talented team in college football every single year. But in terms of what they've actually done this year, go look at what Utah's been doing to opponents lately. I mean, they've been absolutely destroying teams, and they've been doing it against the middle of the Pac-12, which, quite honestly, isn't that much different than the middle of the SEC this year. So because Utah would then have a conference championship and they would have a win over Oregon, which, I mean, we saw them drop 8 spots this week, but you're thinking that's a top 12, top 13 team by the end of the season. That will sit well as opposed to Alabama, which, yes, from a talent perspective, they're the most talented team in the country. I don't think anybody's even arguing that. But when all is said and done, I think that when this all comes together, Utah will have a much better case, much better resume top to bottom, because quite honestly, Alabama's just isn't that beefy this year.
I don't think that Alabama's going to finish ahead of a 12-1 conference champion, be it Utah or Oklahoma, or certainly not Minnesota, if they're able to pull that off. And I'm not sure they would finish ahead of 12-1 LSU losing to Georgia. Alabama's resume has problems. They have been dominant against every team they've played except LSU, the only team to beat them. And if they can do that to Auburn, that's really the only case that they can make. But like Barrett said, and like the committee has said, conference championships do matter. Utah would have a win over a team in the rankings that's probably higher than Auburn at 8-4, even though it's a team Auburn beat. Oklahoma would have 2 wins over Baylor, a team that would probably still be ranked higher than Auburn, the best team Alabama beat. I don't really see a case for 11-1 Alabama with a schedule as relatively soft as it has been this year, with no good non-conference opponent and no good cross-division opponent.
Hey, Jerry, you know, there's an opportunity. Obviously, they play Michigan this weekend, but Ohio State could lose that game to Michigan and still be in the front four. Isn't that correct?
Yes, they could. If they lose to Michigan, they could still win the Big Ten. 12-1 Big Ten champion Ohio State with a loss to Michigan, I'm virtually certain would be a playoff team.
When we look, gentlemen, when we look at this LSU Ohio State, stack them up, if you will. I mentioned the Buckeyes still have Michigan, and then they have prospective Minnesota or Wisconsin in that conference title game, where LSU ultimately looks like they'd have Georgia as the matchup. Should those paths happen, who has the more impressive resume with regards to wins against quality teams?
Well, I think
I think probably. Go ahead, Jerry.
It's probably a tie. Now, LSU would have wins against higher-ranked teams. I think Ohio State would have more wins overall against teams in the rankings. But it's the dominance of Ohio State against their schedule so far. I mean, LSU's defense gave up 38 points to Tennessee. You know, they gave up 28 points. I'm sorry, to Texas. 28 points to Florida. Ohio State's not giving up points to anybody. And they have, except for that Penn State game, that's the first time they've been challenged at all this season. And if they do that to Michigan and they do that to Wisconsin again or to Minnesota, you can't deny Ohio State number one.
Yeah, I mean, I think LSU would have the better resume for sure, but I think Ohio State's the more complete team. I think we've all seen that. Like Jerry said, LSU's defense has been suspect at times throughout the course of the season. Ohio State's has not. So, yeah, from a resume perspective, LSU has the edge. From an eye test perspective, you probably want to give it to Ohio State. And I do think it's very interesting, too, because we can sit here and say number one, number two, oh, they're interchangeable, whatever, no big deal. But when you look at what the option would be for the number one team, it would be the number 4 seed, and there's a big difference between the top 3 and number 4. So it's a big deal for who gets to be number 1 at the end of the season, assuming chalk holds. Now, it's college football, you know, all heck can break loose. That's why we love it. But assuming that chalk holds and you have 1, 2, 3 and a pretty big line of delineation down there to the number 4 spot, it's a huge deal who number 1 is in the college football playoff.
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point, Barrett. And we'll see how it does shake out. My thanks to Barrett Slee and Jerry Palm. Great insight there. We have much more ahead here on the College Football Reaction Show here on CBS Sports HQ. What about the right and wrongs? Who got it right? Who got it wrong in the latest rankings? And how about our what-ifs, if you will? What if we'll play that game on the other side, and the Tide will be our center of attention? That's next. This is CBS Sports HQ.